Good morning, and welcome. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the great privilege of serving as the president of Hunter College, where the American dream still comes true. This morning, I have the privilege of welcoming you in person and to those of you on Zoom, to Roosevelt House, Hunter's crown jewel, the one-time home of two truly seismic figures in the struggle for global human rights, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. As I'm sure all of you know, this was Franklin and Eleanor's home for the 25 years before they moved to the White House. It was here that they incubated aspirations that would ultimately change the arc of human rights around the world. From Franklin, the burning idea of creating a United Nations to preserve peace, promote security, and advocate for the four freedoms he so memorably articulated and whose words are inscribed on the wall behind you. For Eleanor, it was the vision that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to guarantee liberty, equality, and opportunity throughout the globe. What you may not know is that Franklin and Eleanor both made sure that this, their longtime family home, would go to Hunter College. Franklin, whose New Deal programs helped build the school, signed the bill of sale. But Eleanor, who always found inspiration from our students, is the one who really made it happen. I know many of you won't be surprised at that, but we hope that they would both be proud that this townhouse, their house, now serves as a public policy institution fully reflecting, as all of you do who are gathered here today, committed to these issues, the long-time Hunter motto, Mihi Cura Futuri, the care of the future is mine. In addition to greeting you, I have the great pleasure of calling to the podium a visionary leader and friend who exemplifies the spirit and substance of both that motto and of human rights philanthropy. Our beloved Rita Hauser, Hunter Class of 1954, truly represents the best of this theme of the conference that we'll be exploring today. Most of you will not be surprised that Rita was personally mentored by Eleanor Roosevelt herself, who she met as a student, who urged her to study law and hone her leadership skills. So, in addition to all the other things we have to thank Eleanor Roosevelt for, we thank her, Rita, for her support of you. Now, Rita doesn't like for anyone to talk much about her, and she certainly doesn't like anybody to go on long about anything. So I will summarize in a nutshell. Had it not been for Rita Hauser's vision, this human rights program at Roosevelt House simply would not have happened. And if it were not for her generosity, this human rights program might not be today one of the best of its kind in the country, educating and inspiring undergraduates, which is still quite unusual in academia in America, and engaging faculty and practitioners at the highest level. It was Rita who, when we were designing both the architecture of the home and the architecture of the programs, who said, in Eleanor's honor, we must have a human rights program, and we must do it right. So Rita, we thank you today so much for your leadership, for your vision, for your inspiration. We welcome today also our team that we've all worked so closely with, Jonathan Fanton, who was our inaugural leader here, and Harold Holzer, who is now the Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House, and of course Jessica Newworth, the visionary who put this program together, who is the Rita Hauser Director of our Human Rights Program. So Rita, with a deep, deep thanks for everything you've done for Hunter and for this incredible institution, your vision for human rights here and across the globe. It is a pleasure to thank you and welcome you here this morning. Rita Hauser.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And as she said, I like to be brief and get on with the events. It's, of all the things I've done in my life, and I've done lots of things, this is one of the most amazing programs and the one I am most proud of. It was the idea of taking this beautiful house in memory of Eleanor Roosevelt and making it a center here in New York and now globally with Zoom for human rights in all of its dimensions. We thought together, Jonathan and I and Jennifer and all of us together here, Jessica, that the moment was ripe for a review, and we decided on this long before this terrible war in Ukraine unfolded, that there was a past, a present, and hopefully a better future, that it was time to really take a good look at what we hoped for, what has been accomplished and what remains to be accomplished. So that's what we hope will come forth in this program, uniting all kinds of people who have spent, I hope, as much time as I on human rights in the course of their careers. So welcome to this conference. Let's get on with it. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome and good morning. I'm Jessica Newworth. Rita, thank you for your kind words and your support in so many ways, and for being with us here to open this conference on human rights philanthropy. Deep thanks also to Hunter's President Jennifer Rabb and Roosevelt House Director Harold Holzer for their support, as well as Jonathan Fanton and Michelle Alexander, Julie Broom, Kizito Bianca, Larry Cox, Hanny McGalley, and Mary Page, many of whom I'm sure you know, who put this conference together along with our dedicated team at Roosevelt House, particularly Katrina Avila, a graduate of our human rights program who now works with us and masterminded all of the many organizing details. This is our first hybrid conference, and while we have limited the in-person attendance, we have almost 150 people joining us online. So let's see how it goes. As we all watch the daily Russian blitzkrieg on Ukraine, our meeting is very timely. Although, as Rita said, we started working on this long before the invasion of Ukraine. But today we're witnessing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And one thing that has changed in my lifetime is that there is now an international criminal court that has actually charged and convicted military and political leaders, even heads of state, for these crimes. And that court has launched an investigation into the crimes that have been committed in Ukraine. Now, over the next few days, we may all debate the effectiveness of this court and the effectiveness of the international human rights movement as a whole, but it is clear that the deprivation of human rights is taking lives every day around the world in many ways, and we are still struggling to secure accountability for human rights violations and ultimately their prevention. As someone who spent much of my career in the human rights and women's rights movements seeking funds for this urgent work, I am keenly aware of the critical role that human rights philanthropy plays in building organizations, institutions, and the movement as a whole. We are here today to consider over the next day and a half the successes as well as the challenges of human rights philanthropy, and to talk about ways in which to strengthen and maximize its impact. There is no better person to kick off this conference than Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is joining us from Geneva this morning. In 1973, Michelle Bachelet's father was arrested for opposing the military coup in Chile. He was tortured and died in detention. Michelle herself, then a medical student at the University of Chile, was arrested and sent to a secret prison where she also was tortured. Just over 40 years later, she was elected, the first woman to be elected as President of Chile, a position she has held twice, serving in between as the first executive director of UN Women. Michelle Bachelet has been a courageous leader and an outspoken advocate for human rights. It is a tremendous honor to have her with us today, and it is my great pleasure to welcome the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet.
Greetings to all. I want to thank Hunter College for hosting this vital conference that I'm honored to participate. Today, the world faces an array of intersecting crises that seemingly show no end. A pandemic that is far from over, a climate emergency threatening our very survival, inequality standing at record levels. Amidst this, war and conflict rages in many countries, pushing millions from the safety of their homes and putting dignity and human life at grave risk. In the last 6 weeks, since the Russian armed attack began in Ukraine, 1,417 men, women, and children have been killed, and more than 10 million have been forced to flee. The people of Syria have been under bombardment for over a decade. Millions live without proper access to food, water, or healthcare due to Yemen's 7-year war. In Myanmar, military and security forces have killed at least 1,600 people in the last year alone. 1/3 of Afghans face emergency or crisis levels of food security. In Ethiopia, we're witnessing severe and wide-scale human rights violations linked to conflict in the north of the country. The world is no longer simply at a crossroads, it is at a tipping point. But for this long list of interminable crises, the common denominator is clear. Human rights can help us emerge from all of them. It is more urgent than ever before that discussions like today's take place. And while we discuss and debate, it is critical that we recall that the most powerful tool we own to address global crisis and recover from it is human rights. The COVID-19 pandemic has ravaged the fabrics of society across the globe. Now in its third year, it has stolen the life of more than 6 million people. It has destroyed the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of others. It has slammed shut borders, keeping families apart. It has threatened the right of children around the globe to an education. It has also exposed a plethora of inequalities and most severely impacted the peoples whose voices have been historically silenced. Women and girls, indigenous peoples, people of African descent, migrants and refugees, people with disabilities, LGBTI people, minority groups, older people, people deprived of their liberty. There are just some of the individuals and groups whose lives have been upended from the pandemic's consequences. Yet, at a time when we most require the world to come together and support the most vulnerable, we instead continue to witness waves of nationalism. Nationalism which favors the citizens of wealthy countries to receive life-saving vaccines. We're no longer faced with production constraints. Tens of millions of vaccines are expiring unused, and they're not reaching people in low-income countries who are being sentenced to endure the pandemic consequences far longer than those in the developed world. This, if I may say, selfish and immoral policies are setting the pandemic's finish line even further out of sight. In all countries, hospitalization and death keep occurring, predominantly among unvaccinated people. Governments have a clear responsibility. They need to amplify their support to COVAX, for example, to ensure effective access to vaccines for all countries. But dear friends, it's not only governments who are bound to this obligation. This is also where private sector, philanthropic, and civil society actors can all commit to working together in a more collaborative and effective way. As you know, in the face of many challenges over recent years, several large foundations have reduced or eliminated their human rights programs. Having witnessed firsthand the tangible impacts of philanthropic activities on human rights and dignity around the world, I can only encourage such foundations to urgently reconsider their decisions. Now is a window of opportunity to renew and revitalize human rights funding. Friends, the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis are amplified by and interlinked with the climate emergency, an emergency which is upending lives and livelihoods in every corner of the world. Environmental degradation is putting human rights, including to life, health, a healthy environment, housing, decent work, water, culture, development, and self-determination under profound threat. Environmental degradation increases the risk of animal-to-human transmission of viruses. The actions we take to address one crisis can impact or support our ability to address the other. So we are in a race against time. How future generations live with the effect of climate change depends strongly on the action that we take now. For every day that we delay, it is our children who will suffer the most severe consequences. And I cannot underscore enough the importance of public participation in climate change policymaking, particularly by those most affected by its impacts. Their voices are critical to ensuring human rights are placed front and center of countries' responses to the crisis. In this regard, collective action to address climate change is crucial. We have already seen the powerful movements of people's voices around the world on this issue, and we must continue to support their fight. The pandemic, the climate crisis, rising inequalities, increasing conflicts, to tip the world back into a semblance of balance requires transformational change. It requires major, ambitious philanthropic investment in human rights. It requires innovation, vision, leadership, and solidarity. With the depth of expertise in this room today, with the benefit of hindsight and lessons learned, and with a rigorous focus on human rights, we have the key to unlock progress. My office continues to join forces with foundations and philanthropies from around the world to amplify our human rights advocacy and to rally support for human rights defenders. Last year, as one example, we launched a new public-private partnership to fight climate change. The Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Alliance brings together leading scientists, businesses, influencers, and human rights advocates to fight for rights-based climate action for people and the planet. I take this opportunity to extend my deep gratitude to all philanthropic donors who have contributed to the work of my office. We cannot conduct our work without you. It is clear that societies around the world are stronger and more resilient when they are supported with solidarity. International cross-sector ties and links are critical to alleviate suffering, poverty, inequalities, and human rights violations that are occurring at an exponential rate. So we need to step out of our silos. We need the active participation of all sectors of society. Amidst time of extreme global crisis and upheaval, I cannot stress enough the importance of philanthropy directed towards protecting and promoting human rights. Philanthropy can play a key role in helping the world recover better from the pandemic. It can support in the ongoing efforts to mitigate climate change and to adapt to its impact. It can help ensure countries have the necessary means to address development gaps and guarantee no one is left behind. And in a world where we are seeing rising attacks on freedom of speech and expression, directly targeting organizations and individuals who courageously fight for human rights, philanthropic organizations and individuals can direct significant efforts to reverse the shrinking of civic space. Human rights must serve as our blueprint. With the flexibility to use capital to create social change, philanthropy allows for big and bold moves, for long-term social impact, and for provocative and innovative grant-making approaches. I encourage you to continue to display this flexibility and agility in your human rights philanthropy. It is crucial also to strengthen focus on the smaller, grassroots community-based organizations who may not have global recognition, but who fight tirelessly and effectively to uphold human rights. Philanthropic effort must be hardwired to leave no one behind. We need to be aware of unequal distribution of resources and attention on crisis and conflicts which take the media center stage. Philanthropy must not forget the chronic crises which go under the radar and the world most marginalized and vulnerable who are not in the news spotlight. I also urge you to take a participatory approach in your grant-making efforts, engaging with national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, and the people you are funding directly. Supports will increase impact and avoid duplication. And I reiterate the importance of the voices and insights of communities and people with lived experience in decision-making processes. Robust human rights-based projects require solid evidence and data. Similar to initiative by the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, the philanthropic community can leverage strategic partnerships with academia to deliver up-to-date, multi-sectorial, and interdisciplinary research to better guide donor investments. Finally, I remind you also of the critical importance of measuring impact, which our efforts can support. We face a persistent gap in the understanding of how funding human rights work directly benefits the people it is aimed to reach. Through the active promotion of research and analysis on human rights indicators, the philanthropic community is uniquely placed to advance the implementation of human rights standards and commitments. This supports policy development and increases transparency. Friends, we are now at the halfway point in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which laid out 17 goals for the world to achieve by the end of this decade. Some of these targets include ending poverty and hunger, achieving gender equality, ensuring access to quality education for all, and guaranteeing employment for everybody, no matter where they live or where they were born. Unfortunately, we're facing serious setbacks in achieving these goals. Collective action is becoming ever more urgent. The UN Secretary General's call to action for human rights lays out his transformative vision for human rights. It also provides new grounds for public-private partnership. As we recover from the pandemic, such partnerships will be key to advance towards more inclusive and equal society. I have also spoken previously about the importance of what we have called a human rights economy. At its simplest, the human rights economy is an economy that not only prioritizes inclusive, sustainable economic growth, but that has people and their human rights at its core focus. Economies which put human rights at their center are the most resilient and inclusive economies. They are economies which choose to invest in social spending essential to protect and promote fundamental human rights, such as the right to health, social protection, education, food, water, housing, development, and a healthy environment. Now more than ever, human rights economies are what we need to advance. Dear friends, at a time of unprecedented global economic and social upheaval, we need the support of everybody to eliminate human tragedy and advance towards a world with human rights and human dignity at its core. Human rights benefit and protect us all, and they require urgent and collective action. Now is the time to work together to advance the human rights agenda and achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. Now is the time to implement your leadership, your vision, and your dedication to human rights. My office commits to support your efforts. Thank you for your engagement and your innovation and for helping us pave the path to a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future. I wish you an inspiring and productive discussion ahead. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for those very encouraging words, High Commissioner, and for sharing with us your vision of a human rights movement that is central to so many challenges we're facing in the world. Now, before we start our morning panel, we wanted to share with you some thoughts from Aryeh Neier, a giant in the human rights movement. Aryeh Neier came to the United States at the age of 2 as a refugee from Nazi Germany. He joined the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1960s and worked there for 15 years, serving 8 of those as its executive director. In 1978, he was among the founders of Helsinki Watch, which later turned into Human Rights Watch, which Aryeh led for 12 years as executive director. For almost 20 years after that, he served as president of the Open Society Foundations, which has given billions of dollars to philanthropic causes and has been one of the major funders in the human rights movement that Aryeh Neier helped to build. Last week, Aryeh sat down with Gara LaMarche, who worked with him at the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, and the Open Society Foundations, where Gara served as the first director of U.S. programs. Gara went on to lead Atlantic Philanthropies as president and CEO, and most recently served as the president of Democracy Alliance. Gara spoke with Aryeh about his transition from a grantee to a grantor and the tremendous role he has played in shaping the human rights movement. Here are some excerpts of that conversation, with great thanks to Daniel Culkin for taping and editing.
I'm happy to be joined here for this conversation at Roosevelt House today by Aryeh Neier, who has been the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, one of the founders and executive director of Human Rights Watch, and the founding president of the what are now called the Open Society Foundations, the foundation established by George Soros. And in those roles, in each of those capacities, I worked for Aryeh, so I have tracked Aryeh's career over 40-some years. In each of these roles, Aryeh has had a significant influence and impact on human rights in the United States and around the world. So on the occasion of talking about the interconnections between philanthropy and human rights, there aren't many people whose career has spanned a wider range of involvement in those issues and has had more impact on those issues than Aryeh Neier. So thank you for coming here to have this conversation today, Aryeh. I wanted to start out, since I've referenced the fact that you spent more than 30 years in the principal leadership position in the organizations that I have mentioned. What did you learn from your extensive experience in those roles in which you had a lot of dealings with funders? You had to raise money at the ACLU, you raised money at Human Rights Watch. In that period of time, what shaped your view of the role of philanthropy positively and negatively? When you came into a job where finally, not something I think you particularly aspired to, but you found yourself with this tremendous opportunity to help George Soros give out his money when he was just starting his philanthropy in earnest. And when you went into the job, what did you say to yourself? I'd like to not to repeat these mistakes, or I'd like to do this a certain way. What did you learn from that you applied to your own role in philanthropy?
Well, I learned early on in working for the American Civil Liberties Union that the key to raising funds was the personal confidence that the donor had in the chief executive of the organization. Regardless of the substance of the activity, there had to be trust that the chief executive would deal with the grant in an appropriate way. And unless one established that sense of trust, it would be very difficult to raise funds, and unless one maintained the trust, it would be difficult to get renewals of support. I also learned that there were a number of difficulties in raising funds. One of the difficulties was that donors were often ready to fund particular projects, but not ready to give general support to an organization. And this actually was not a huge problem at the ACLU or at Human Rights Watch, because we always had in both organizations quite a lot of funding that was not earmarked. But I knew fellow organizations that principally obtained earmarked support and often got into difficulty because of that.
So what I'm interested in exploring a little bit is what made Open Society, in your view, distinctive as a human rights funder. You know, you got support when you were at Human Rights Watch in the early days from the Ford Foundation initially, for Helsinki Watch, I guess, and the Fund for Free Expression that became Human Rights Watch. If I recall correctly, the MacArthur Foundation helped the expansion into other regions like Africa and the Middle East, and perhaps Asia. Irene Diamond was a big supporter in the early days, and you had the benefit of people who actually believed enough in the general mission to give you funds that you could use to create the program without having to worry about earmarks. So when you got to Open Society, what made it a distinctive? It's a large human rights funder, maybe the largest, but what makes it distinctive? Is it the nature of the staff? Is it the somewhat devolutionary nature of the philanthropy, since Soros has got this network of foundations that spread out?
I think a number of things made it distinctive. First, I had a deeper civil liberties and human rights background than some other people who were involved in grant giving. That is, I had been for 30 years on the other side of the table, and so I knew what it was like from the standpoint of those having to carry out projects. And a number of the people who joined me at the Open Society Foundation also had had experience on the grant raising side of the operation. I think another thing that made it distinctive is that we had an unusual donor. The donor was never intimidated by the possibility that a grant would lead us into a particularly controversial area, that we were able to engage in somewhat riskier fundraising, grant giving than other foundations.
One of the things I remember as being very distinctive, both in the United States and around the world, about Soros is that the boards that were put together in the 50 or 60 places where Soros were active often included people who had never had access to philanthropic resources, and largely were often had been marginal in their own societies. Yes. So you had in Guatemala with indigenous people, or the board we put together in Baltimore was a majority black board in a city where most of the philanthropic power had been white. And the point you make about George's appetite for risk is partly who he is and the nature, and partly the fact that he's a living donor who can make his own decisions, and often quick decisions. People often say about Henry Ford or other dead donors, they'd be rolling over in their grave. And I used to say, well, George Soros is not rolling over in any grave. He knows exactly what we're doing. I always remember in the United States, when we started the U.S. programs, we had a whole host of issues we wanted to deal with, criminal justice and youth and reproductive rights and campaign finance reform, not immigration. And there came a moment in 1996 where the Congress passed and Clinton signed a very repressive bill cutting off immigrants from legal welfare benefits. And George came to us, to you and me, I was very new in the job, and said, I just think this is outrageous. I want to do something about it. I'd like to spend $50 million, which was a lot of money to me then and now. But, you know, within a month, we created a program which we had never even thought of creating to deal with immigration in the United States that lasted 3 or 4 years, reversed the benefit cuts, and also did a lot of other good things. And so that was an exhilarating opportunity to be able to do that. And very few more established foundations can act so quickly and boldly or color outside.
I shifted from Human Rights Watch to what was then called the Open Society Institute in 1993. And a major factor in my shift was that the wars were underway in the former Yugoslavia, and particularly the war in Bosnia. And George had been very moved by what was going on in Bosnia. Ethnic cleansing particularly disturbed him. He had, lived through the Nazi period in Hungary in World War II, and this was somewhat reminiscent of what he had lived through. I was also a refugee from Nazi Germany, and so George, on that occasion, told me and a few other people that he wanted to spend $50 million in Bosnia at that time, calling attention to the ethnic cleansing and trying to mobilize international opinion against what was taking place.
So to that extent, let's go, I wanted to ask you a question about a very large grant of your tenure. So while you were still the president, Soros made I think $100 million challenge grant to Human Rights Watch over 10 years of time, which was already a highly successful organization. It became, its reach expanded significantly since then. So some people at the time, mostly privately, thought, well, that's a lot of money to give to the already dominant player in the field, and what about the grassroots organizations around the world that could benefit from that kind of commitment? So what would your answer to that be? And because I know Soros also did fund a lot of grassroots organizations. Is it something, is it good for any player to become so big and dominant in a field?
I thought it was. Let me say first, in terms of that grant, there were occasions subsequently in which George attributed that grant to me, and because I had previously been the director of Human Rights Watch, a lot of other people thought that I was the principal figure in that grant. It is not the case. I was at the meeting between my successor at Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, and George Soros, in which that grant was given. And I sat through most of that meeting silently, and George was the instigator of that grant. In fact, Ken had asked George for a grant of $5 million a year, and George upped it to $10 million a year over a 10-year period. Nevertheless, although I was not the moving party in the grant, I very much supported it. A number of reasons. One is that it did not in any way diminish the other funding that we were engaged in the human rights field. And we engaged in funding in the human rights field through various programs that we administered centrally in the foundation. but a large part of the funding that we did in the human rights field was given by the different national foundations and regional foundations we had created in other parts of the world. We had created some 30 national and regional foundations, and the regional foundations covered most of the countries of Africa. And there was quite a lot of human rights funding that came from those national and regional foundations, in addition to the funding that we provided centrally from the headquarters office in New York. So it didn't subtract from any other funding. It was additional funding that George provided. A second factor is that there was a very good relationship between Human Rights Watch and national human rights organizations in different parts of the world. Many national human rights organizations experienced reprisals from governments, and Human Rights Watch always put foremost on its agenda protecting national human rights organizations when they faced persecution or other difficulties. And therefore the national organizations in general had excellent relations with Human Rights Watch. In addition to their own protection, they were very often glad of the international resonance that they would get for their findings about human rights abuses in their own countries by the fact that Human Rights Watch would publicize these abuses on a global basis. Sometimes an organization would be largely ignored in its own country, and then when Human Rights Watch took up the issue, it would become a significant matter within those countries. Another factor in that grant is that the principal condition that George had put on the grant is that Human Rights Watch should substantially increase the funding it was getting from donors outside the United States. And in fact, Human Rights Watch did very well in increasing its funding from donors in various parts of the world, principally from donors in Europe, but it also did quite well in generating support from donors in countries such as India and Japan, which had not been available to the human rights movement prior to that. So I thought that was generally good for the human rights movement to get funding from other parts of the world, and not only from the United States and not only from other Western countries.
As I've studied at fairly close range your career in all these institutions, one of the things that I associate with your personal influence, not only by yourself, but every institution you've led has kind of expanded the scope of what is understood to be the scope of human rights protection. So the ACLU, proud history, but wasn't until your tenure in the 60s and the 70s where they began to deal somewhat more forthrightly with racial justice and to establish programs. You hired Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to establish a women's rights program, dealt with the rights of children and mental patients and military personnel and all kinds of figures who had not necessarily been front and center in the civil liberties work. Similarly, at Human Rights Watch with projects of a similar nature, and that is one aspect of your influence.
By the way, the area which I particularly think was important was that at Human Rights Watch, we took on the issue of abuses in military conflict, and we monitored compliance with international humanitarian law. That was not the practice in the human rights field previously. There were some other organizations and some donors that were quite antagonistic to that. I should say that as things have turned out, I have been criticized quite a lot for my failure to take on the economic and social rights issues. I have always been focused on the civil and political rights issues, and I have felt that economic issues should be dealt with through the democratic process, through legislative activity. So I expanded the agenda in some respects, but I've been strongly criticized for failing to take on other issues.
Let me close here by asking you, we're sitting here at a time where if you've been working for 60 years as you have, or 40-some years as I have in this field, it's hard to be optimistic these days. It's hard not to feel that, the whole leaps forward that were taken, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, have yielded to a period of increasing authoritarianism, open hostility to minorities. And as you sit here looking both to the past and toward the future, how do you feel about the unraveling of the apparent unraveling of so much of what we've been working on?
I feel very bad about the unraveling. As you say, in the 1980s and the 1990s, we made significant headway. The revolutions in Eastern Europe, the transformations that took place in Latin America and in some countries in Asia made us very optimistic about the future of human rights. And today, as one looks around the world, a large number of the important states and some that one might think of as less important geopolitically have authoritarian rulers today. I wouldn't say that things are as bad as they were during the height of the Cold War period, when the communist regimes were in full control in Eastern Europe, and when there were military dictatorships in most countries of Latin America and a large number of countries of East Asia. But it's plain that we have as great a burden today in trying to once again reverse the trend as we had in that earlier period. I don't think it's hopeless. I will say one of the things that I feel best about is that I did manage to launch quite a few internship programs in the human rights field. And I love meeting with the interns. I find them the great hope in the human rights field.
Well, thanks for your time today, Aria.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I think we've set the stage well for our first panel, and I should note that this interview was taped upstairs in the Four Freedoms room. But now we get to have live in-person discussion, and it's a pleasure to welcome the panel and its chair, Jonathan Fanton, with whom I've had the great privilege to work with here at Roosevelt House, where he served as the founding director, among so many other leadership roles in education and in the human rights movement. Jonathan served as president of the MacArthur Foundation from 1999 to 2009, prior to which he was president of the New School for Social Research for almost 10 years. He has served on and chaired numerous boards, including the Board of Human Rights Watch and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Jonathan helped bring this conference to life. I want to thank him for his guidance in this and in so much else. Having played such a key role in the philanthropy that built our human rights movement, he is the perfect chair for this first panel on the history of human rights philanthropy. Please welcome Jonathan Fanton, and let me also invite the panelists to come to the stage, or in some cases, I think on the screen.
Well, good morning. It's nice to see you all, so many friends and colleagues of years past. It's like a reunion. It's a great honor for me to moderate this first panel, which explores the history of human rights and philanthropy. And I do want to again thank Rita Hauser, who had the idea for this conference. And it's really broader than just the conference. Her thought is that Roosevelt House and its human rights program should be a convening point for the human rights movement and for organizations, both educational and NGOs working in human rights. And so this is really, I think, the first big step forward. In a moment, I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll pose questions for discussion. As the session proceeds, I may call on people in the audience to be part of our conversation, because this really isn't a series of lectures. It's really a conversation that involves us all. After about 75 minutes, where we'll just be talking back and forth and maybe involving people like Ken Roth, who's here, we'll open the floor to questions and comments, including, and I hope all the people online on Zoom will put in the chat room their own questions. As Jessica has said, my own experience comes both from working with Jerry Labor in the early days and Helsinki Watch, and then working with Ken as chair of the board of Human Rights Watch, and of course at MacArthur working with Mary Page, who'll be joining us in a moment, as MacArthur expanded its human rights work, especially focusing on Russia, Nigeria, and Mexico. From both the Human Rights Watch and the MacArthur vantage points, I came to appreciate the important role philanthropy plays in building the modern human rights movement. And by philanthropy, I mean, yes, large foundations like MacArthur, Ford, Open Society, major individual donors like Irene Diamond and Herb and Marion Sandler and Sigrid Rousing, for example, thousands of individual small donors, but also people who join membership organizations like Amnesty. And then there have been moments where religious organizations, think of the Catholic Church in South America, have played an important role, and even occasional corporation. So when we talk about philanthropy, it's really beyond the major foundations we've been talking about. So when you think about some things that philanthropy has helped with, I would say it certainly helped build international organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and Physicians for Human Rights and Human Rights First, so-called anchor institutions. But it's also helped local and regional NGOs in Nigeria, the Clean Foundation, the Legal Defense and Assistance Project. In Mexico, Fundar, and Russia, Women of the Don, Committee Against Torture. And on a regional basis, the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH, based in France, or the Redress Trust, based in the UK, or the Asia Pacific Forum of Human Rights Institutions. So global, local, regional, all have received support from philanthropy. Some NGOs had a broad mandate for political rights. Others were focused on issues like free speech or women's rights, media rights, police reform, international justice, regional human rights courts and commissions, new technologies in defense of human rights. And so there's no one size fits all. It's a mosaic, it's a portfolio of grantees. And some organizations like the Center for Islamic Studies in Northern Nigeria and the Kazan Human Rights Center in Tardistan pursued local challenges, while others like the Russian Public Movement for Human Rights and the Moscow Helsinki Group focused on advocacy across the whole country and beyond. And academic centers like the Berkeley Human Rights Center and the Carr Center at Harvard, the Posen Family Center at Human Rights at University of Chicago help build the theoretical framework for human rights and also educate a younger generation. Philanthropy also helped build new institutions like the ICC, new agreements like the treaty to ban landmines, and new norms like the responsibility to protect. Now, as we cover those and other topics, I hope we'll keep philanthropy in perspective. It played an important role, but often a supporting role, to policymakers, courageous volunteers, and a dedicated public. In other words, we should have some humility and some perspective in what we do. The role of our first panel is to trace the history of philanthropy and human rights from the late 70s to the early 2000s. Our panel includes in alphabetical order a statesman, Lloyd Axworthy, an early frontline advocate, Jerry Leiber, Foundation executive, Vinnie McGee, Foundation executive and leading jurist, Willie Mutunga, and Mary Page, who will be working with Lloyd Axworthy, and she was at the MacArthur Foundation. And I'd like each person in their own voice to say just a sentence or two about who they are and their experience. And if Lloyd Axworthy, if you're on, I'd like you to go first.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you perfectly, thank you.
Okay, that's great. I apologize for first not being able to join you in person, and also because my sort of immune system took a hit this weekend. I established a kind of a grip, as they called it in old-fashioned terms, of a little fever and a little sore throat. So I'm kind of limited, and I hope that it doesn't totally affect my coherence. I come at this, I guess, from two different but complementary perspectives. One is while in government, I found that the opportunity to work with foundations to complement the efforts that we made to advance human rights in its largest sense of the right of protection, the right against violence, the right against atrocities, was very essential, beginning with the landmine treaty that in Canada we took a leading role in coordinating and being a catalyst. But the partnership we have with the NGO community was absolutely essential, and that was very much supported.
Here I'd just like a little biography. You were Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada. We'll get to the landmine.
Oh, yeah, okay, I'm sorry. I thought we were launching in. No, I was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and was very reliant. And then when I left or retired, I became a member of the board of MacArthur, where I chaired the international committee and was involved again in MacArthur's very extensive work for several years until that mandate was changed.
Thank you. Jerry Leiber?
Well, I'm one of the founders of Helsinki Watch, which grew to be Human Rights Watch. I ran the division that dealt with the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, now known as the Europe and Central Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. I was there until 2002 when I retired, and I've been writing since then. I wrote a memoir called The Courage of Strangers, coming of age with the human rights movement, which really describes the very early days of the human rights movement and of Helsinki Watch and the growth of Human Rights Watch, as well as being a personal memoir about my own role in it. And that has become a kind of Bible for the newly arrived people.
Could you hold this a little closer to you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Everyone, I'm told everyone who starts working at the organization gets a copy of my book, so they know that it started with a handful of people even though it is so enormous today that many people compare it to the United Nations. I also recently wrote a novel called The Russian Key, which is a suspense novel. It was a new undertaking for me. It also, despite the fact that I set out to write a novel of suspense, it ends up having a large human rights sections, underlying themes throughout it. So that's what I've been up to.
Thank you. Vinny?
I became involved in the civil liberties human rights movement as a student at the University of Rochester, where I was working in the daytime at Eastman Kodak on the production line and going to school at night. This was in the mid to late 60s. I became more and more concerned about the Vietnam War and realized my only connection to the war was my draft card. So I went down to the local office of ACLU, spoke to Herman Walsh, a lawyer, and he said, well, if you do what you're planning to do, you're going to go to jail. I burned half my draft card and mailed the other half to President Johnson. Went to do some graduate work at Union Theological Seminary, but became more involved in the anti-war movement. While my case was taken up by the ACLU and went to the Supreme Court. While that was happening, I ran a group of 6,000 business executives against the war. They were doing lobbying, and they were doing, many of them, their own philanthropy in areas that would be related to human rights. In that process, I met and worked closely with Bob Bernstein, who sent me books every month while I was in jail and shared with my other war resistors. And I met Carol Bernstein Ferry, invited me to help her with family philanthropy and personal giving. And then through various other connections, while I was in jail, I was adopted as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. I later went on the board and became chair of the board in the US in the late 70s, early 80s. I remember hiring Larry Cox as our initial public relations communications person. That gave me the opportunity to work in organized philanthropy. I'd been impressed by the membership at Amnesty International, but also at ACLU, which were the strengths of the organizations going back a long time. My luck was that a board member at Amnesty was in the firm that was representing a real estate man who just died, Aaron Diamond. I was introduced to Irene Diamond. In our first substantive meeting, she said, Mr. McGee, what do you know about America's Watch? So I gave her a history. Fast forward. But I think about my biography, I've had the unique experience, perhaps shared with Gara and Aryeh in a way, of working as an activist, but being part of formal funding for human rights work. And I was particularly pleased with Commissioner Bachelet talking about COVID and what I call access to health, because I've long disagreed with Aryeh, he knows it, we've debated this, that we must take the full Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including access to health and education and other things, to be really responsive to human rights and what it needs.
Good, thank you. Willie, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
You're speaking to us from where?
From Nairobi, Kenya. That's where I'm based.
Yes, a couple words about yourself and your own background.
Yeah. You know, my human rights activism starts when I taught law at the University of Nairobi in the 70s. And I was also the Secretary General of the trade union, the University Staff Union. and we focused our work on academic freedom. Because at the university, the dictatorship then tried to tell us, what to teach, how to teach it, and some of us got into trouble. So I ended up in detention myself. And when I got out of this detention, I founded and participated in quite a number of human rights organizations in Kenya. I also served as a director in rights and democracy in Canada, and so for a long time we were involved in human rights activism, and we engaged in constitution making, monitoring human rights violations, until 2004, when I joined the Ford Foundation as a program officer in human rights and social justice. And some of my former colleagues are around, Martin, Larry Cox, and others. And it's from the Ford Foundation that I was hired as the Chief Justice and President of the Supreme Court in Kenya. And I served for 6 years between 2011 and 2016. And as the apex court in Kenya, we were engaged in developing very progressive human rights jurisprudence based on our 2010 Constitution, which has in Chapter 4 a very, very progressive Bill of Rights. That will be all, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then we have Mary Page on. Mary worked with me at MacArthur and was a really leader of our human rights program. So I'm now going to ask a series of questions and invite one of our panelists to speak first and then the other to respond. We have about 7 minutes per question, so I ask you to have that in mind as we go along. So the first question is this. I'm going to ask it of Jerry Labor and then Vinnie McGee to comment. Human Rights Watch started as Helsinki Watch, focusing on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, as I recall, then followed by the formation of America's Watch, focusing on authoritarian Latin American countries, often countries politically aligned with the U.S. And so I asked, where did the initial money for Human Rights Watch come from? Also, Vinnie, from your Amnesty experience, where did the support for Amnesty in the early days come from? How did the Cold War affect issues and emphasis of the human rights movement? And is there any difference in how the source of funding from Human Rights Watch, which was more centralized, and Amnesty, which came from a broader membership, did that shape the mandate and the effectiveness of the organizations, if at all, maybe not? So, Jerry, you first, and then Vinnie.
A number of different questions. I'll start with the first one.
You don't have to answer them all. just pick ones that appeal.
The formation of Helsinki Watch, which grew to be Human Rights Watch, was quite unique, and in the sense that it was formed, we did not solicit the money. The money came to us, which is something I think does not happen very often in this world of philanthropy. It was an initial grant from the Ford Foundation. We were approached by McGeorge Bundy, who was the president of the foundation at the time, and asked if we would be interested in forming a U.S. Helsinki Watch committee. Now, the we was a handful of people, basically a group called the Fund for Free Expression, that had been set up by Bob Bernstein, who was the president and CEO of Random House Publishing. Bob had and I and the people he included all had a very strong concern with what was happening in the Soviet Union at that time. They were mainly literary people that he asked to join this initial group, well-known writers and publishers and newspaper people. And at that point, the Soviet Union had more writers in prison than all the other writers in prison in all the other countries of the world. And we were following them in particular. But it was not, we were not an organization. We were really just a group of people that Bob had assembled, prestigious people that we met maybe once a month in Random House at the boardroom. And we talked about what was happening and what we could do, and we had a few projects. We had no money. The little money we had came from the members themselves, contributions that they made just to cover expenses. I was a consultant to the group, so I would put together materials in advance, so when we met, we would have materials to discuss. And the only major project we really had was forming a book exhibit for the Moscow Book Fair, which was for the 1979 Moscow Book Fair. It was an attempt to evade Soviet censorship, which was very strong at these fairs, and we came up with the idea of having an exhibit called America Through American Eyes. All the books were published in the United States and were about the United States. So there was nothing controversial on the surface, but we picked books that showed how free we were to criticize our government, how diverse our life in this country was. It was sort of a subtle way of making a point to the Soviet people. And it was accompanied by a catalog in Russian and English, which made the points described each of the books. And for that catalog, we did get a grant from the New York Times Foundation. They agreed to publish it for us in, I think it was 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 copies, because that was really the way we were going to get the word out to people who weren't even allowed to come to the book fair to see the exhibit. Anyway, that's where we were at the point when we were offered or suggested that we form a Helsinki group, something we had not even considered before. And this was in April of 1978. We were given almost immediately a $50,000 planning grant, and by the end of that year, we were given $400,000 to cover us for 2 years. From Ford. The idea was that we would be working toward and have a presence at the second Helsinki Review Conference, which opened in Madrid in 1980. It was not, by the way, the best way to start an organization. I mean, we had no office, we had no staff, we had no program. We really didn't know what we were going to do, and we had an expiration date. We had 2 years to do it and to prove ourselves. And we had a number of false starts before we pulled it all together. A lot of this is in my book, if you're curious about it.
Thank you. Thank you. That's good.
So,
maybe, Vinny, we ask you to one more quick comment, because we're.
Well, I just wanted to say, even though it wasn't the best way to start, it all turned out well, because
It sure did.
It led to Human Rights Watch, which now,
Yeah.
the last time I looked at, is something like a $96 million yearly budget.
That's good. Thank you, Jerry. Vinny.
So the story at Amnesty is quite different. Amnesty was founded following a letter in the Observer in London and Le Monde by a man named Benenson, raising the point of individuals who were imprisoned around the world, who were nonviolent, but imprisoned because of their ideas. He had a huge response. 2,000 or 3,000 letters in the first few months. Gradually, that became organized committees, particularly in Scandinavia and in Western Europe. The context was in the mid-60s and even into the 70s. For example, in Germany, there are a series of laws enacted after the Second World War, Berufsverbot, which forbid people to be involved with certain kinds of activity, anything socialist, anything that smacked of too much Marxism, and so forth. So there was an appetite for involvement. And by the late 60s, early 70s, there were very large national sections of Amnesty in Germany, in France, in Italy, certainly in Scandinavia, Holland. And there was a system of election of representatives to an international executive committee that oversaw the centralized research which was in London. One could argue this was an incredible strength. Later, after the breakup of the Soviet Union and an evolution of possibilities of involvement in issues around human rights around the world, I would argue that it may have been a detriment to Amnesty because there were too many people expressing their opinions and moving resources in the international movement to favor different causes. In the US, the initial work of Amnesty was mainly centered in a small committee of fairly conservative people, Bill Buckley, the best known. And Amnesty was held back, interestingly, in terms of its direct mail, where it's raised a huge amount of money, because in postal authorities around the country, letters to direct mail lists that said Amnesty International were pushed to the back of the shelf. After a while, Amnesty woke up and it just said AIUSA, and the mail went through. And within a few years, mainly through this direct mail program, AIUSA became the big money in the movement, which then had to be controlled, and we can talk about that in other points. But the point I want to make in that experience, because I'm obviously involved with the ACLU's strength then and continues to be individual memberships. The big money, the foundation money and so forth, large donors, has come later. And the point I want to make in those comments is that the indigenous human rights work around the world on different issues has preceded formal foundation or large donor funding and has pulled those resources into support for the work. Another point, around the same time the work Jerry was doing was being funded by Ford. I remember a meeting at Ford with David Heaps, perhaps the officer you were dealing with. Why? Because European sections of Amnesty were arguing that Amnesty shouldn't take money, certainly not from governments, which Amnesty never did, shouldn't take money from US foundations because it was all tainted money. Well, we got through that, but it was a difficult period.
So that leads me to a couple other questions. The next one is I'm going to ask of Willie and Lloyd perhaps can comment, and that's the role private philanthropy generally played in building or influencing the human rights movement beyond the U.S. and Europe. In the 1990s, human rights organizations began to grow across Africa. And what was the role of philanthropy in this growth? And was there a role in fighting apartheid in South Africa, for example? So, Willie, perhaps you could start, and then Lloyd, you may have a comment. Willie, are you still with us? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm still here. Thanks, Jonathan. Um, in case of in the case of Kenya, for example, the human rights movement, starts in early 90s. The Kenya Human Rights Commission, which is one of the oldest human rights organization in Kenya, was actually registered in the US in 1991 because it wasn't possible to operate in Kenya then. But things changed, and by 1994, we had an office, in Kenya, and we got our funds from private philanthropy, Ford Foundation, Rights and Democracy in Canada, but we also got money from European, particularly the Nordic missions in Nairobi. They were very, very strong in funding this embryonic human rights organization. And also some of the NGOs like HIVOS and Novib, the Dutch ones, and also the Swedish ones, the Swedish Foundation for Human Rights. So there were all these also NGOs, European, that funded our human rights, human rights work. And so basically, it's when the Soviet empire collapsed in 1989, that's when there was a movement for multipartism, in Africa, and East Africa, and so the one-party dictatorships were of course challenged, and they did concede to multipartism. And initially, the focus was on civil and political rights, because opposition groups wanted the right movement, the freedom of expression, assembly, and we focused, on that, and later focused on, economic, cultural, and social rights when we started, writing the constitution. And because the movement was growing in various parts of Africa, there was a lot of solidarity within East Africa. Groups worked together, and within Africa as well. And I know for the issue you raised about South Africa, I know the Ford Foundation had by 1991 a program that dealt with that issue. And I did go to Port Elizabeth actually around 1991, funded by that particular group. I think Gay McDougall was ahead of that one. And so the solidarities in human rights movements were growing in the 90s, and obviously private philanthropy was important, and the Ford Foundation for East Africa, led the way, giving core support as well as programmatic support.
Good, thank you. Thank you. And Lloyd, anything you'd like to add in terms of philanthropy?
Well, there's a few points. I don't have a lot of time, as you know, I'm kind of contending with a little bit of a fever and cold, but let me just come to a very important point that I don't think has yet been raised, that philanthropy and governments have both a necessary but sometimes uneasy relationship. I found that my own activity as a foreign minister was greatly enhanced and amplified by being able to work out partnerships with large American philanthropic foundations to complement the work that we were doing on human security initiatives, beginning with the Landmine Treaty, where Rockefeller was very important in supporting the work of civil organizations, the coalition that was a necessary element in pursuing the effort to ban personnel landmines, which was successful. And I think without that kind of complement, it would have been a real drawback because governments are uneasy often in providing direct support to civil organizations. So they find it, depending on their bureaucracy, a little awkward. Another area where there was an enormous contribution came from MacArthur, and that was in the workup towards the Rome Statute in the International Criminal Court. I don't have to go through the history, but as you know, the United States was a strong opponent of it, at least officially, although my relationship with Madeleine Albright was very cordial. She was very much supportive of the idea, but couldn't get it through the Pentagon and other kinds of places. As a result, we again were able to rely upon support from the foundations, and MacArthur in particular, to support kind of complementary work. A couple of examples, Jonathan, you know, because you were part of it, was made to support the effort to mentor and provide support for smaller countries so they could participate in the Rome Conference and understand the implications of providing a international criminal court, and particularly how there was a strong lead towards the establishment of regional hybrid courts as eventually emerged in Sierra Leone. A third area, which again was, you asked the question earlier about norms and institutions. When we launched in Canada with the support of Kofi Annan, the Commission on Sovereignty and Intervention, to really begin to deal with what is the basis for international involvement to stop ethnic cleansing in Kosovo and massacres and in Bosnia and places of that kind, we were able to use the resources coming from the foundations to do some serious research going all the way back to Augustine and Just War, but a lot of much more technical legal issues that provided the kind of granular discussion within the commission itself, which, as we know, came out with the R2P, responsibility to protect idea, which was then advanced again by philanthropic support to extend that again into a broader level of application, which fortunately ended up in 2005 by the UN Leaders Summit actually adopting that as a principle and a protocol for the UN. Those are, I'm giving you the very short 5-cent versions, but in each of those cases, I think that the effort and the initiative that we took from as a government in developing those both norms and institutions to provide for protection of people, stopping sort of genocides, holding people, particularly holding the bad guys accountable, was very much based on the ability to draw upon philanthropic funds that came from the large US foundations, and it was a major enabling point. I'll just close that remark, so I'm going to say, I regret now how much that particular kind of support and resource has been withdrawn. This no longer seems to be a mandate that many of the philanthropic efforts have. We're too busy going off to space, I guess. But the reality is that I think that there is a increasing need, and as Ian Neer said in his comments, we're now into an era where human rights is under real duress, and there's a whole range of new supports that are required. And I would hope that one of the outcomes of this conference would be to see how that could be reignited and redressed in a way by, and I'll just give you an example. I chair the World Refugee Migration Council, and we're working very sort of substantially in trying to find ways of having refugee displaced persons participating and involved in finding solutions and answers to their own problems. We've set up a network of girls and women and refugee communities around the world. That is backstopped by the IKEA Foundation, which is our major benefactor right now in enabling this. And it then gives us the kind of platform which we can then go to various governments to find sort of contributing support. So I think in the area that I'm particularly engaged in right now as a retired politician is in the refugees, displaced persons. It's an area that needs an enormous amount of help. The UN system doesn't even come close to meeting the humanitarian requirements. We see the breakdown in Ukraine where we can't even get a UN presence in the corridors to protect people. I mean, it's a shambles right now. And I think that there has to be some reinvestment back into what are those institutional answers, and do we build on the existing institutions, or do we find some new forms of international architecture to deal with it? So
thank you, Lloyd.
With that, I'm going to leave it, and I'm going to have to leave the panels, because I have to return to my recuperation.
Well, you're very kind to get out of your sick bed and comment on this question, which is one that you really know best. And before you go, Mary Page, would you want to add any specifics about some of the ways private philanthropy helped in the building of the court and the responsibility to protect?
Just a couple of things. Lloyd already referred to bringing smaller countries together when the statute was being written. But I think philanthropy also, after the statute was approved and needed to be implemented in different countries, it supported different human rights activists to go to those countries and help them to understand just exactly what it would mean for their constitutions and laws.
Yeah. Okay, Vinny, did you have a comment here?
Oh, okay, you'll be there in a couple of minutes.
Comment.
Thank you.
I think we need to be very careful about looking at labels. I take example, Diamond Foundation was early involved in the AIDS field. Colleagues said, we don't have an AIDS program in our foundation. But I said, or others said, you have a housing program, you have a civil liberties program, you have various other things. I think, I don't want to be Pollyanna about where fields are going, but I would look to see where the activity of human rights funding under the label has been absorbed in other programs, in philanthropy formally and in individual giving. So access to health is a human rights program, women's rights and other things. And sometimes because of semantics, but other times because of board anxiety about labels, things don't get done. And an inventive staff or advocates can move money that really is human rights money.
So I want to thank you. And Lloyd, you probably signed off, but if you haven't, thank you very, very much for that very helpful comment. Vinny mentioned earlier a question about taking government money to human rights organizations. And so there are kind of a couple questions here. One is, should philanthropy be hesitant to invest in NGOs that are also taking government money? And do we have some examples of where funders, private philanthropy or government, exercised some perhaps undue or unwelcome influence on NGOs? Jerry? And I might ask Ken Roth to think about that as well.
I can give both a good example and a bad example. The good example being in our International Helsinki Federation for Human Rights, we included a number of human rights groups, they were Helsinki groups at that point, from Scandinavia and the Netherlands, all of which received government funding. Private foundations were not operating in their countries the way they do in the United States. and I saw them. They were well funded. I never saw any indication that there was any government interference in their work. So that was a good example. The bad example I had was with the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States. Human Rights Watch, Helsinki Watch, of course, did not take government funding, but I also worked with a group of publishers, and which was a business organization and had no qualms about taking money from wherever they could get it. And that exhibit, the second exhibit we did that I was describing before, was done under the auspices of the Association of American Publishers. We did that again in 1985, and I had the bright idea of why not get the National Endowment for Democracy to give us a grant for it, because we were scrambling for money. And we did get a grant. We got a grant of $50,000 from them, and our independent group of volunteers who just selected the books for the exhibit, headed by Kurt Vonnegut, came up with a program of books to be exhibited. The endowment asked to see the program, and when they saw it, they didn't like it. They felt it was one-sided. They wanted to know why Henry Kissinger's book wasn't on the list, and a few other things like that. And it became a very public dispute. We ended up giving the money back to the endowment, but with a great deal of publicity, which I think they found quite embarrassing.
So Ken, let me maybe put you on the spot, and he'll need a microphone. You and I, when I was chair, we had a little trouble about our work in the Middle East and our attention to Israel, Palestine. And did you feel any pressure from any of our, in this case, probably more private donors on that? And if so, how did you respond?
Yeah, Jonathan. Yeah, I have to say that this this view that like Israel is like untouchable and you're going to get in donor problems, I've never found that to be true. You know, there is an occasional donor who pulls out because of the Israel work, but what I found is that, you know, most people who care foremost about protecting Israel rather than defending human rights principles already don't fund us. And so, you know, the risk is really quite small. And I learned this initially, you know, back in the war in southern Lebanon, where Human Rights Watch was very critical of the Israeli government for, among other things, dropping cluster munitions in southern Lebanon and indiscriminately killing civilians. And, you know, this was a somewhat provocative thing to do. It got a lot of media attention, and it made almost no difference to our donors. And so, you know, apart from, you know, we obviously had one very high-profile case of our former chair, not you, but your predecessor, you know, breaking with the organization over Israel. Overall, in terms of our finances, it really made no difference. And so I you know, learned early on that we should just do what we do, be factual, be principled, and we'll live with the consequences, which have been actually rather few.
Thank you. So what I hear from that is that, on the whole, there's not much influence that private donors seek to impose, and when they do, it doesn't change the direction of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, you know, fortunately, Human Rights Watch, you know, is known at this stage not to be manipulable by donors, and so they tend not to try. But I was asked this question. I mean, Ari referred in his opening presentation to, you know, Soros's $100 million gift, and I remember being asked at the time, you know, oh, does this mean that Soros is going to call all the shots now at Human Rights Watch? And my response then, which, you know, ended up being accurate, is that George wouldn't have given us the money if he thought we could be manipulated. You know, he knew exactly who we were. He was investing in the principles, and he never tried to manipulate what we did. So I just, you know, now obviously we're kind of known that way, so people don't try, but I do think it's important to, you know, for any organization, just to kind of maintain that position, and the money will come to you for what you are.
Good. Thank you. And Vinny and Willie, if you have anything to add. Vinny first.
Just in terms of the Middle East, at a certain point, Amnesty was, I think, rightly criticized because we were in the Middle East only focusing on Israel. The problem was, and the issue was raised by membership, not particularly by big donors, was that we didn't have expertise in Islamic law in the Muslim countries. Well, over a couple of years, we got that expertise, and it created a balance which was very important.
Good. Willie, anything you'd like to add?
Only to say that our organization also were adapted finding out about the politics, of various donors. So we didn't knock at the doors of donors we thought were going to basically subvert our vision and our projects in human rights.
Yeah. So while you have the floor, let me ask you a question. After working for the Ford Foundation in East Africa for 7 years, you became Chief Justice, President of the Supreme Court in Kenya. How did your experience in human rights philanthropy shape your experience, if at all? And could you comment on the ICC with regards to the indictment of the Kenyan president, deputy president in 2013?
Thank you, Jonathan. Working at the Ford Foundation obviously was a great experience. And also as a human rights activist, I became adept at fundraising when I was at the Kenya Human Rights Commission. So that expertise in fundraising and also being a funder is something that I took to the Supreme Court, to the judiciary. The Office of the Chief Justice had 2 secretaries and 8 bodyguards, but it didn't have the capacity that was very, very, very important in terms of the leadership of that particular institution. So I was able, given my experience with donors, to raise money to build that capacity from the World Bank, UNDP, European missions, the Ford Foundation, the Open Society, and that we were able to, within the judiciary, to get the Judiciary Training Institute, for example, funded, and that was a very, very important institution. So we of course, also push the government, the Kenyan government, to give us money, which luckily, we got our budget increased from 3 billion to 17 billion. But this other money that we got helped us build courts and also deal with other programs. And for 6 years, we had a transformation program that was funded by the government, but there was this money from private philanthropies and World Bank and missions in Kenya that helped and reinforced our transformation, judiciary transformation framework, which was our blueprint. As to the ICC that you mentioned, the Kenyan constitution basically states very, very, very clearly that the treaties and conventions that our country has ratified become the law of Kenya. So when the ICC happened, I was Chief Justice, and there was great collaboration between the ICC and the judiciary. We helped them interview witnesses in our premises, and of course that brought problems between the judiciary and the president and the deputy president who are indicted. But through dialogue and also relying on our constitution, we were able to explain very, very, very clearly where the judiciary stood on that matter of the ICC. And also, we were able to benefit from the ICC cases because the ordinary people in Kenya and the civil society groups were very, very happy that this happened. That there was a court, an international court, which would hold our dictators accountable. And it was great to see them in the dock in Den Haag when they were indicted. But we played our part in terms of that solidarity with the ICC.
Good. Well, thank you. So we've been talking about the role that philanthropy has played in launching and supporting some of the major international groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. We've talked about philanthropy's role in working with governments to bring about the Landmine Treaty and the responsibility to protect and helping on the margins maybe, but importantly on the ICC. We've talked about philanthropy, or begun to talk about philanthropy, reaching out beyond the international organizations to help and build human rights movements in various countries around the world. And so I'd like to return to that and ask two sort of related questions. One, a little more example of philanthropy's work in building local organizations, but also the role philanthropy perhaps has played indirectly in building leadership in countries around the world. As I look, and Mary Page can comment on this, at NGOs we supported and their leaders, and then watching how people in Russia and Nigeria, Mexico, among others, have evolved into leadership roles, sometimes in government, but in powerful positions advocating and protecting human rights. And so the whole question of private philanthropy both in our country and helping train young people in human rights and law at universities, but also actually on the ground in these countries around the world. So let me ask that as a kind of two-part question. Could we hear a little bit about philanthropy and supporting local human rights groups, and philanthropy and building leadership at the local level? And maybe, Mary, you could comment on that, and then I'd ask anybody else who's interested to come in. Mary?
Sure. I can give you some examples of some of the people that were leaders in their organizations, since MacArthur did not do a lot of grant making for individuals. I'd like to call these enduring successes, and I'll just name a few people in the countries that we were working. In Nigeria, for example, Innocent Chukwuma, who was the founder of the Clean Foundation on Police Reform, went on to be the Ford Foundation's West Africa division director. Nankin Bagadu, League for Human Rights, Coyote Fiyemi, the Center for Democracy and Liberation, were elected later to public office as the Commissioner of the Environment in Plateau State and the Governor of Ekiti State. And Sadatu Mahdi, whose organization worked on women's rights under Sharia law, has served in the Buhari government as the director of the President's Initiative in the Northeast. Now, in Mexico, Abel Barrera, who founded Tlachinolan in the mountains of Guerrero State, became internationally recognized for his work, both at the Regional Court Regional Court of Human Rights, and received a Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award. Marie Claire Acosta, who was the founder of one of the earliest human rights organizations, the Comisión Mexicana, supported very early on by the MacArthur Foundation, served as the Undersecretary of Human Rights and Democracy in the Fox administration, and was the UNESCO Chair in Education for Peace. Lucha Castro from the Center for Women's Rights is in the Chihuahua Ministry of the Judiciary, and Jose Antonio Guevara, also from the Mexican Commission, was subsequently UN Rapporteur and the chair of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions. So these were all people and organizations that we funded the organization, but they went on to greater things. I'll just mention some Russian examples, although their future right now is somewhat in doubt. But the young Russian lawyer for media rights in the city of Voronezh, Galina Arapova, serves on the board of the UK-based Article 19. Ivan Pavlov, now working from outside Russia, is considered a leading legal voice on freedom of expression and espionage cases. And Anton Burkhoff from the human rights NGO Suchaznik in Ekaterinburg won a Kennan Institute Fellowship, received a PhD from Cambridge University, and went on to serve as the chair of the law faculty at Humanitarian University in Ekaterinburg.
So those are some
So,
pretty,
there's a sample.
yeah, some pretty impressive examples. Yeah, Jerry.
When we first formed Helsinki Watch, I think one of the best decisions I ever made was to hire as a part-time consultant a woman named Ludmila Alexeyeva, who was the representative of the Moscow Helsinki group living abroad. Luda worked with us on a paid part-time basis throughout the entire period until the Gorbachev years, at which point I think she returned to Moscow and became the head of a newly formed Moscow Helsinki group that really came into its own after the fall of the Soviet Union. And when I was invited back to talk on an anniversary of some, I don't know, it was a signing of the Helsinki, of course what it was some anniversary that the Moscow group was celebrating, and I went to Moscow. This was probably in the early 1990s. And I was absolutely amazed to see that this woman who had been invaluable in giving us information about what was happening in the Soviet Union, at the same time had been totally absorbing what we were doing here in the United States. And here was this organization, their reports looked like ours, except they were in Russian. They had the same kind of graphic design on the cover. The structure of the organization, she said to me when she said, "No, I want you to meet I'm Bob Bernstein," she said, "and wait till you meet our Jerry Labor." Each person was sort of modeled on the people who were working in the United States. So it was a wonderful example of someone who we helped support in her time of exile, and who came back and put it to wonderful use. Unfortunately, she's no longer with us.
Vinny, do you have any comment on this, on the local level?
Yes, I mean, there are many success stories. In South Africa, in particular, part of my experience working with Atlantic Philanthropies was that a number of local leaders in specific branches of human rights, but in education and health, were funded from the outside and developed programs. The difficulty over time is to sustain those organizations because the philanthropy sector isn't as strong. There are lots of money in South Africa, but with due respect to Human Rights Watch, a number of organizations in South Africa complained to me that when Human Rights Watch had its first couple of events, all the big donors went to Human Rights Watch and they stopped funding the local stuff. And I had this issue, frankly, with Mrs. Diamond. After she made her $30 million commitment to Human Rights Watch, she said, "I'm funding human rights. why should we fund Amnesty or the Reporters Committee or various other things? So we have to watch those kind of things. The other thing is to look at history and some of the people in Latin America, in Central Europe and so forth, Zimbabwe, who were greeted as human rights champions and turned out to be horror stories. Sandinistas, Mugabe, people around Mugabe, Hungary, look at it. We have to keep those things in mind. I don't know how you know, I remember when Amnesty was getting a lot of credit for unseating the Shah. 2 years later, the same people were beating us over the head because Khomeini was in charge. If we hadn't gotten rid of the Shah, well, so here's the complicated world we're living in.
For sure, and MacArthur really set aside, to your point, a certain part of its human rights budget to support local groups. So we did not want there to be a competition between the anchor institutions like Human Rights Watch and group in Russia like Women of the Don or the Clean Foundation in Nigeria or Fundar in Mexico. And we even in Russia decided that the human rights local money was too much, St. Petersburg and Moscow. And so we had an intermediary that would give small grants to local human rights groups all across Russia. And I think we had, I don't know, Mary, how many we had at the, including the ones that were re-grants, but there were a huge number. And so we were very conscious of wanting to help build local human rights NGO sector. And the problem Vinny mentions, however, is real, and that is how we put the initial investment in, but then where would other monies come from? And that's something I don't think we've really solved. So let me move on to this question. How should private philanthropy think about working in authoritarian countries? I think we've just been talking about Russia, but I also think of China. Neither country ever made it easy for private money to go to civil society groups, and of course in Russia it's now all the harder. So should private philanthropy tell itself, well, just not much we can do in these countries, and therefore we should invest in places where we can have larger impact and more immediate impact? Or should private philanthropy really risk going into these countries, including some of the things Vinny was talking about, where the money gets perverted? So who would, maybe Vinny and Jerry on that question?
I want to talk about Russia a bit. I'm trustee of some funds left by Andrew Gagarin. He was born in St. Petersburg, fled with his parents, the butler and the samovar, but he never forgot his history. And he created an informal funding program in St. Petersburg, the city of his birth. We teased him, called it the Babushka Fund, because he put American dollars through his remaining family in St. Petersburg into giving small grants in the late 80s and early 90s to older people whose pensions were evaporating because of the volatility of the ruble. But he then incorporated in St. Petersburg a foundation called the Gagarin Fund, and asked me at one point, would I go, he couldn't make a trip, would I go over? And I said, what do you want me to do? This is 95. He said, well, they need some money. So I went to St. Petersburg with $40,000 under my shirt, and some of those investments have turned out to be durable. One example we've read about in the press recently is Mothers' Voices. The mothers of soldiers who came to the fore because of Chechnya, what was happening to their sons and so forth. They're still a viable group, very hard. They survive on volunteer networks, but they've made an influence, and we read about them in the press. I first met Ivan Pavlov, who was mentioned, because of work Gagarin was supporting of Alexander Nikitin, a Soviet naval man who blew the whistle on Soviets dumping nuclear waste into the sea. Ivan went through a number of different kinds of organizations. I talked to him the other day. He's in Tbilisi. Like many others, he said, nobody has a visa to get out of there. But we created in the State University of St. Petersburg an officially recognized Gagarin Center for the Study of Civil Society and Human Rights. We sponsored a number of conferences. This is a program in conjunction with Bard College, which created a liberal arts program within the State University. Our first public event was a World Conference on HIV and Human Rights, opened by Jim Kim, head of the WHO at the time, and final speaker, Ludmila Alexieva. The Moscow group had put out an important critical study of Soviet reaction to AIDS. We're now trying with our remaining funds to rescue many of the people working with us in St. Petersburg who are trying to get out. And most funders, understandably, are focused on Ukraine. But Russia is bleeding talent that hopefully can be preserved, potentially for return to Russia, but also to bring the message around.
Jerry, you want to comment on the general question of should philanthropy be putting money into repressive countries?
The answer, of course, is yes, if it can. I think what's happening in Russia right now is so depressing. And our Human Rights Watch Moscow office is still functioning, although quietly at the moment. Every time I see a headline in the paper, I expect to see that it's been closed. For some reason, it still is open. I think philanthropy should be trying to figure out ingenious ways of getting money into Russia, for example, under the radar. What they are, I don't know. If I were still in my old position, I would be spending a lot of time trying to figure it out, and I suspect that that is going on without me as well.
And I can add a couple stories here. As I said, MacArthur supported a lot of organizations, maybe as many as 100 all across Russia. And I was, Mary Page and I reached out a few months ago and wrote some of the leaders and just said, you know, we're still here even though MacArthur's closed its office, and I wouldn't have, but it did. And, but we still care. And so I was in Moscow, and I had breakfast with one of the smaller human rights groups, but an important one in Moscow. He came with Metropole Hotel, came in, and he laid a newspaper out on the breakfast table. I looked at it, and it was a newspaper, local newspaper, with a picture of trees. I said, what's this? Oh, he said, this is what we're doing. If we were to stand up for human rights overtly, we'd be shut down. But we're now interested in the overcutting by developers of beautiful trees in Moscow. And the government's quite happy with that task. And the idea is to keep our group together for the moment, no matter how far out, where there's an opening when we can come back to our human rights agenda. And he said, this is happening across the country. The groups that you supported no longer can push human rights, but are finding more benign topics in order to keep together. And I thought that's a powerful point. China. I wanted to work in China on human rights, and obviously not easy. We're talking 10 years ago. So I went over and I began to look around, and I was at the Tsinghua Law School, and talking to the dean, and he said, we'd love support for our law students to go out and do legal services as part of their learning process. And there are people all through central China who are suffering terrible human rights abuses at the hands of local governments. For example, property being seized without due process and fines and local things, but they involve health and housing. And he said the federal government would be only too happy to see us empowering local people in the middle of the country to push back on local authorities who are getting too powerful and cheeky for the Beijing government. Okay, so it's a pretty convoluted reasoning, but it is training a younger generation of lawyers to worry about and defend the rights of local people. One more story. While I was there, MacArthur had a big, in the U.S., juvenile justice program. And turns out juvenile justice issues are big in Russia. And so a group of judges, prominent judges, came to the U.S. to learn about our juvenile justice work. So there are ways of working in these countries, and I'm for engagement. I'm not for backing off. So let me ask a kind of general question here. And anybody else have any other comments on that one? Working in authoritarian countries? No. So let me ask, we're getting near the end of our formal period, and we want to open it up to you, including people online. So people online, if you would put in the chat function your questions, and I think Mary Page is going to curate those and ask them on your behalf. So let me ask this general question. While the Universal Declaration of Human Rights encompasses a broad definition of human rights, early human rights organizations like Amnesty and HRW focused on deprivation of liberty, torture, free speech, and other civil and political rights. Over time, the movement has expanded to encompass a broad range of social, economic, and cultural rights, even climate change. REA alluded to all this. And has this expansion, often fueled by private philanthropy, has strengthened or weakened the movement, and what role has private philanthropy played in the expansion of the definition of the human rights movement? And this is a question open to all, so all three or four panelists.
Well, I would say it's played, private philanthropy, a very important role. It goes back much longer than recent years. I mean, just think in the U.S., the Rosenwald Foundation and 2,000 small schools in the Black South with an interesting formula, 1/3 from Rosenthal, 1/3 from public sources, and 1/3 from the community. But in terms of the expansion of human rights into the various categories, I think it's essential that all of these things happen if they create a public awareness and a public action that moves towards impact in government. Because private sources will never have enough money to make change. So here's why I think we can look positively at some of the work on access to health, on women's issues, on LGBT issues that have changed society in very important ways. Look at the issues just of marriage in the US, how that has changed in terms of definition and practice. Think in South Africa, for example, one of, if not maybe the only country, because they had the opportunity of writing a constitution de novo, that incorporates the Universal Declaration. Yet the Constitutional Court has made specific rulings on marriage equity, on the rights of widows, because under the old law, the family money stayed with the husband's side and so forth. So there are a lot of opportunities, but the key thing is to generate public support. And this is where we're losing the game to the development of authoritarian government, because there aren't enough local institutions and voices militating and actively involving change.
Yeah. Jerry? Well, maybe take your I have a. So when when our work in Eastern Europe was pretty focused on the kind of traditional definition of human rights, and as you've watched what's happened in those countries, do you think it has been progress has been less good because the human rights movement is less focused, or?
Follow it. I think the human rights movement has expanded as these issues have become more important in those countries. So I think we are focusing on them now in a way that we didn't when.
And you see that, as to Vinny's point, as helpful in building
Definitely,
a broad support.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Willie, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yes, the private philanthropy in Kenya and East Africa focused on constitution making, which, as I said earlier, gave birth to a progressive Bill of Rights, and even now, private philanthropy does fund organizations that are involved in the implementation of the Constitution, what we call the public interest litigation, where there are organizations that would go to court to challenge statutes that are subversive of the Constitution, legislation, and during the COVID, for example, that's when I realized this. This funding for transformative constitution was very, very, very important, because the economic, social, and cultural rights in the Bill of Rights, for example, in the case of for Kenya, talks about the right to health, education, housing, the right to food, and all those rights during the pandemic have created a lot of agitation and activism around them, by human rights groups and local groups. So I think that was great investment, and also the constitutions themselves give a lot of power to people. There is the value of public participation. There is also issues of devolution, where equitable distribution of resources is impacted. So what we're calling transformation or change, is degreed in the Constitution, and there's a lot of mobilization, organization to actually implement the Constitution, which, of course, it's opposed by forces that were against, constitution making. But that struggle is a good one. In the case of Kenya, for example, it's pushed, the government on a lot of fronts, simply because people are quoting the Constitution and they're saying we must implement the Constitution, the right to education. It becomes a political issue simply because it's in the constitution. So I would say it's great that private philanthropy, apart from focusing on the human rights groups that were working, focused on this supreme law, which actually turned out to be very transformative.
Good, thank you. So now I want to open up to questions from the audience, including online. And I'd ask you two things. If you would simply say who you are, and then make it a question. So we'll take questions here, and then in a few minutes we'll break and go on to the people online. Then we'll come back here. We'll just rotate back and forth so that we have a large family here. Rita Hauser, and the microphone will come to you. So Rita Hauser needs no introduction.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion, and it was great to go back in history. And I didn't know a lot of things about how a lot of these things actually started, so it's worthwhile reviewing them. I have a basic question, which is, how do you distinguish between the human rights movement, as all of us understand it, I think, and the refugee issue? Which are they separate? Are they looked at differently by the human rights community? Who funds the repatriation of refugees? Obviously, we're all thinking about this in terms of Ukraine. Do you see that as a human rights issue, or is it a distinctive issue dealing with the question of repatriation?
Well, we have a senior member of Human Rights Watch here, and maybe she would tell us. In the back row. And you heard the question, right?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. Thanks very much. My name's Tarana Hassan. I'm the Chief Programs Officer at Human Rights Watch. I'm a later iteration of Jerry. But I think we see the refugee work very much as part of the fundamental human rights work. And even in terms of the human rights protection issues that come up in relation to Ukraine, that's actually fundamental to where we're working right now. We see those as core human rights issues for the affected populations of the war. I think overall, though, we have a refugee and migrant rights program, and we have that actually built in to all of our work, and it builds fundamentally, it intersects with all of the work that we do on the international humanitarian law and the conflict work. So we see it integrated and a fundamental part of the work.
Yeah, and I think there's another connection that might not seem as obvious, but there is a movement led by a judge based in Boston gaining wide support now to have a conference that would be something like the Rome Conference that would be focused on creating an international anti-corruption court. And the connection between mega corruption, refugees, and human rights abuses, is real. And so that's another, connection to be watching. Other questions? Yes.
My name is Yulia Emtseva. Thank you so much for this fascinating
and could
panel.
you just say one more,
Yeah, sure. This panel is of great interest because I'm writing my PhD, and my PhD is about the role of private organizations in transitional justice, but it's very related to human rights. So, my interest in this event and in this panel especially is obvious. I have three very brief questions, and the first one is to Ms. Laber. And the question relates to what you said, to the initial funding of Helsinki Group or Helsinki Watch. I was wondering what was the underlying reason of the Ford Foundation to start sponsoring your organization, because you said you worked back then on Soviet and then post-Soviet space. And I'm asking myself a question whether they were interested in the topic or in your organization and in your expertise. Because I'm originally from Kyrgyzstan, and I think I was the one who benefited from your work back then, right? And I didn't know about this before I heard you. So I would be very happy to to hear the answer to this question, and also maybe to what Ken Ross said before with regards to influence, is that now Human Rights Watch can afford not to be influenced by donors. Was it different back then? Was it different when you started the organization? And then I have a very brief question to Mr. McGee, because you mentioned that Amnesty International didn't want to take money from US philanthropies, but then it changed its mind, and I would be happy if you could elaborate on this a bit. And my third question was meant to for Mr. Axworthy, but I think actually that Mr. Fenton, you could answer my question as well, because you worked at the MacArthur Foundation. And now when I was listening to Mr. Axworthy, he was telling us how the Canadian government, and now as he in his role of in the Refugee Council, has worked with Rockefeller Foundation or with other foundations. And my question is it easy for a private philanthropic foundation to work with a foreign government, or there are some problems in this?
Okay, good, thank you. So Jerry first, then Vinny, and then I'll speak.
So many questions. You wanted to know.
You have only one, though.
Yes. You want to know how they came to us. Is that? Yeah. It's an interesting story, actually, because the first Helsinki Review Conference, and these conferences were not conferences, they were became institutions. The first one lasted for 5 months, the second one lasted for 3 years. So it was the only time that East-West were negotiating and sitting at the same table during those very tense Cold War years. So they took on an extra importance. Well, with the first conference, the ambassador was Arthur Goldberg, a former Supreme Court justice, ambassador to the United Nations. And before he went off to this conference, which was in Belgrade in 1977, he had an open meeting at the State Department for people who were interested. And I went to that. I was interested in what the Helsinki movement was all about. You know, I was very new at that point. It turned out I seemed to be the only person, there were a lot of people there, but I was the only one who was not representing an ethnic minority that had been abused by the Soviet government. I was sort of representing a group of concerned American citizens, and he singled me out afterwards and asked me if I would write a briefing paper for him, which I did, under the heading of the Fund for Free Expression, this amorphous group that we were working with. And when he came back from Belgrade, he was really upset because he had done a lot of groundbreaking things there. He had called out the names of certain Helsinki monitors in the Soviet Union who were sentenced to hard labor. That was sort of, you know, he broke new ground, and nobody was paying any attention to what he'd done. There was no coverage in the US press. The American public didn't know what was going on in Belgrade. So he was the one who went to McGeorge Bundy at the Ford Foundation. He said, what we need is a group, a US Helsinki Watch Committee, and I've been in touch with these people who seemed, you know, interested in this, you know, in this issue, get in touch with them, and that's how they came to call on us.
And I'm sure Jerry would be happy to talk to you offline when you get to writing your paper. Yes, read it.
Two examples. In Amnesty, there was concern about money from U.S. foundations. It was also in the context of the U.S. getting a great deal more of individual support. And we talked that through, and the way we got around it was, not accepting money that was specifically earmarked for different projects unless Amnesty had asked for it. But within the international movement, we created a rule, kind of taxation, that sections had a specific amount allocated that they should raise for the international. And if we had excess money, the money would go into a program reserve fund at the international level, and the whole movement, through its governing boards, would decide on how that money was allocated. So it meant that the U.S. couldn't control various things or seem to control. In Human Rights Watch, I remember Peter Goldmark, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, calling me and saying, Vinny, you've been involved in nonviolence and peace issues and human rights. Why isn't there a group that's putting them together? I said, well, Peter, you need to talk to Aryeh Neier. And what came out of that was the initial money for the arms project, and specifically the work that Cam Anderson did in a very important report on landmines. But again, the funder had raised the issue. The organization had gone back and said, here's the way we would use that. And it was hands-off and so forth. Now, in Amnesty, many meetings would happen locally around the world using a public space. But we didn't consider that to be government influence. And if donors came, money only for this or that, we sometimes said no.
So on the third question, how can foundations work with governments? On the story of the responsibility to protect, this was something that Kofi Annan wanted to do through the UN but couldn't, because it was really to come up with a new norm that said when a country couldn't or wouldn't protect its own people or even attacked its own people, then the responsibility transcended state sovereignty and rose to the international level as a responsibility to protect. And so Lloyd and I met for dinner at the Four Seasons restaurant, the old one, and I didn't know him, but we talked, and he said Kofi had asked him as Foreign Minister of Canada if he could get together some countries that would have a conference on this and maybe even then have a commission. But he said, I don't have any money for it, and so Mark Arthur put up the money. And it led to a commission that Gareth Evans of Australia chaired, and that came up with this new norm called the responsibility to protect. On the International Criminal Court, once it got authorized, there was one little problem. There wasn't any money to worry about the logistics of actually getting it set up. And so, again, they came to us and we put up, we weren't the only ones, but we put up a substantial sum of money before the state funding kicked in to do things like find the building it was going to be in and hire staff assistants to the chief judge and so forth. Okay, other questions? You had a question. There's a mic will come your way.
Touched
Okay, so maybe Reagan, would you like to comment on that question? And tell the audience who you are?
Ralph with the Fund for Global Human Rights. Oh gosh, I have a whole panel that I'm going to be talking about this tomorrow, but I think that you're absolutely right that the amount of philanthropic resources that go to local human rights organizations is still is larger than it was 20 years ago, and there are organizations like mine that have played a role both in making it possible for donors to deliver resources directly to those organizations and individuals, and have also encouraged and shown others the way to do it. I think, as the panel alluded to, we are facing a new range of challenges in being able to do that. And I think one of the things that continues to get in the way, not with everybody in private philanthropy, but with a lot of folks, is fear of risk. And people manage risk by trying to control what people spend their money on. They manage risk by trying to avoid reputational damage. They manage risk by not wanting to lose their money and therefore not putting it in high stakes, highly difficult environments. And governments have figured that out, and so they have started restricting the ability of local organizations to raise money from outside their countries. There are ways around that in almost every place that you could name, but it's difficult and it's high risk. And that's, I think, a challenge that we need to be thinking about, how we take advantage of the relative strengths, like what Martin experienced 30 years ago, and think about how we take advantage of our different strengths and positions of opportunity and power to be able to keep delivering those resources, because they need more now, not less.
Could you give us an example of a way around, a workaround?
I don't know who's on the phone, so I'm not actually going to get terribly specific.
That's all right.
But all I would say is that an organization like the Fund for Global Human Rights, we don't break the law, but we use the law to our advantage in ways that is not always in line with what the government is trying to do. And I don't mean the U.S. government. I mean the governments in the countries where we're delivering the resources. So there's a lot of stuff. Some of it's sort of bureaucratic and administrative, and just in terms of the mechanisms that you use to deliver resources, and other things are a little wilier.
Yeah. Okay, Mary Page, can we go to you and get some questions from those who are online, and we'll come back to you next. Mary?
So I have a couple of questions. The first is from Rana Pelagal, who asks if you think that more of the funding should have gone earlier to grassroots human rights groups and movements rather than international anchor institutions.
This is from Rona, who works for Human Rights Watch, right?
She no longer works for Human Rights Watch. I believe
she
she
used
is
to.
with the Global Fund for Human Rights now.
Yeah, she used to.
Yeah. Right. The second question that I have is from Kimberly Stanton.
Maybe unless they're related, let's do them separately.
Okay, all right.
So there's Rona's question: should more money from private philanthropy have gone to local groups earlier?
Well, there's so many variations in the possibilities. First off, in the dynamic of moving these resources, it's not only money. People have to ask. There are different ways to ask, and sometimes it's hard to ask. Donors, particularly organized ones, have to be able to say no quickly and clearly, and if possible, define what things they're open to funding. But things happen on the ground because there's a local need. And small amount of outside resources may help, and then more resources can be added. So some groups, small groups in even inner city communities, don't have any membership money, but people are participating by helping to feed people or doing tag sales or whatnot. So what does membership mean? So as a funder, I want to know, do you have 600 members who pay $2 a year? That's an important statement. Are you looking for resources in the community that you can utilize without spending money? So it depends on situations, and one
Yeah.
never knows.
Yeah, my answer to that question is yes. I think we should have begun a greater attention to local groups earlier and more generously, and I think that's still a challenge. But Larry, do you have any thoughts on that question? I'm asking you if you had any thoughts from your time at Ford on whether we should have done more earlier to get money to local groups.
For sure. I mean, it's an easy answer. I think Ford, when I was there at least, which was about 11 years, had a policy which was because it had local offices that it was a priority, in fact, and they didn't want those local offices were the ones who knew what was happening at the local level, and they were therefore, finding the local leaders, finding the local groups, and that enabled Ford, I think, much earlier, I think, than a lot of other foundations, to do just what you're saying we all wish we had done more of. I mean, obviously, you could have done more of it. I just since I have this mic, I just want to add one more thing, which is about the way that foundations influence the whole field. And this actually is related to the question of local versus international. You asked earlier a question, and I think Ken answered it very well, about how it's not so much that foundations give money and then say you can't do this kind of work or you can't do that kind of work. But the kind of money that is given and the amount of money that's given sends a message to the whole field of activism. And activism follows the money. So if they see a huge ton of money going to an organization, they say, aha, we want to do good work, but to do it, we got to be like that organization. It has a huge influence on the field. If they see money going to this issue, but not to that issue, let's say money going to civil and political rights, but very little going to economic and social rights, they say, well, we're really interested in economic social, but let's concentrate on civil and political rights. So so I think the local versus international is that when you give a lot of money to international, you are in fact influencing lots of other people to try to be or try to get connected to those international organizations rather than building grassroots movements. And just the last thing is that movement building rather than NGO building is the other way that foundations can play a very, I would call, negative role in shaping the field, because it's much easier for a foundation to fund a well-heeled, with lawyers, NGO, like some in the room, than it is to try to build a sloppy, messy, dynamic, grassroots movement that you never know. It goes back to what Reagan was saying about high risk. It's much more high risk. So those are all just areas where I think...
Good, very thoughtful. Willie, from your perspective, should international foundations have been putting more money into local groups earlier?
Larry, said, and I agree with him, that as far as the Ford Foundation is concerned, they initially funded, middle class human rights groups, lawyers and journalists. But these groups incubated, social movements and social justice movements at the grassroots. And, after some time, maybe I guess after a decade or so, this bridge between the middle class human rights activists and their grassroots compatriots actually happened. That's how in the Ford Foundation, the local program officers, and I was one of those. I knew who to fund and where the money will have great impact, and who could incubate, a great, grassroots movement, so that there was that, that connection. But I also wanted to say you have to look at also the solidarity between what you are calling national and local and the international, because I think it's Harinaya who talked about protection. A lot of the groups that were human rights groups that were founded in the 90s needed that protection from the international human rights movement to operate. Not money, but the solidarities.
Yeah. Well, speaking of solidarity, Jerry, in your experience in the 80s, was Human Rights Watch, Helsinki Watch, were you helping build or give advice or encouragement to local groups that ultimately became movements or NGOs? Do you have a couple stories you could tell us?
Figure out which ones. There's so many. Of course, we were working
give us just a couple.
With groups both in the communist countries who are being persecuted, and also setting up an international Helsinki Federation in Europe and countries that were free. I can talk about, I was thinking as this conversation was going on about the ways in which we circumvented, got money into these countries. Now, it was very difficult because if you went to the Soviet Union or any one of the satellite countries, you had to declare the amount of money you had in your wallet, and any jewelry or anything of value as you entered the country, and then when you left, they checked to make sure that everything that you brought in came out, or that you could account for where it had gone. So we were very careful. I was very careful in my missions to Eastern Europe. I never brought money until finally I did. I did it in Czechoslovakia for the Czech Helsinki Committee, which had asked me specifically for financial help, and I brought in $2,000, which was a small fortune on the black market at that time in Czechoslovakia. I carried it in on a money belt, and they searched me, but they didn't search my person. So I got it there, and I was able to leave it. On another occasion, we were going to Moscow. This was during the beginning of the Gorbachev period, and we had gotten a request for a computer, a laptop computer, from a dissident group. George Soros very generously paid for the laptop. It was a Toshiba. It cost $4,000, and it did not have a hard drive. The hard drive was, this is what the state of the art at the time, it was separate. You had inserted it into the machine. But we had it, it was a very, it was a very sophisticated machine for the time. We had a program for the Russian language, and I was going in with a group of publishers. That's how I got in several times for the book fairs. And as I was waiting online, I had this case with the computer in it, and I thought, they're going to search me. They know who I am. They're going to always search me. They're going to ask me to open this thing, and then I'm going to have to declare it and bring it out again. And I turned to the woman online next to me, who I barely knew, but she was part of the publishing delegation. It was her first trip to Moscow. I said, would you mind bringing this in for me? The worst thing that can happen is that they'll ask you to declare it. She went and breezed right through with it. I, of course, got searched, and once we got it there, we got it to the right people.
That's a great story. Thank you. Thank you. Mary, you had another question?
Yes, this is possibly a lead-in to the next panel. It comes from Kimberly Stanton, who is the Democratic Staff Director for the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the U.S. House. She also worked for MacArthur in the 1990s, and cites comments earlier about the role of philanthropy in supporting or developing the theoretical framework for human rights. She feels there's a need to renew this work in light of the Trump administration's Inalienable Rights Commission and other efforts in the U.S. to return the definition and enforcement of rights to the state level. Could panelists comment on this aspect?
I do think that's going to be a core topic in the upcoming panels, so maybe we shouldn't
Okay.
Preempt that now. We have another question here in the room.
Hi, Felice Gear, the Jacob Blaustein Institute for Human Rights. Vinny, you talked about
A little louder, please.
Vinny, you talked about how the movement is perceived, and Reagan raised the question of how it's perceived by donors, by the philanthropic community. I wonder if the panelists could comment on sort of an overarching issue. I was at Ford when the grants were given to Helsinki Watch, and I remember those phone calls from Arthur Goldberg and others. The question, the perception, the popular perception of human rights was that it was to defend the defenders. That has moved to punish the perpetrators, prosecute the perpetrators, and today even to sanction the people you think are the perpetrators, never mind the defense. Now, how this moved and why it moved has a lot to do with the inefficacy of the human rights movement. But it also has to do with the whole issue of popular perception of violence. That is to say, wartime violence, and terrorism. And I'm wondering, in the 70s we had the generals in South America, we had El Salvador afterwards. The question is, how did those affect these early years of support from the philanthropic community? Did it affect the ability to pursue the defend the defenders approach, or did it lead you in a different direction?
Benny?
I would differ with you in terms of what I heard you say about the inefficacy of the movement. I think part of the movement in time is that because things were effective, from moral suasion and so forth, the opposition devised new ways to do their thing. And I think part of the strength of the international movement, whether you call it human rights or climate change or access to health or whatever, is that the movement is much more resourceful in getting some things done. Now, obviously, there's a trade-off, and there are constant challenges. So some of us were talking earlier about the importance of having grassroots in various places, organized and active politically. So I don't think it's so simple in terms of hitting a stone wall and then backing off. I think you go around the wall or you go under the wall. But it's a constant challenge. And one of the challenges, I think, also from organized philanthropy is that many boards don't see the importance of staff resources enough to make decisions about smaller grants and local organizing. Many foundation boards think it can be done by one person or two people, and there aren't resources made available. And just one example, a coalition of funders led by the Joyce Merce Gilmore Foundation challenged community foundations around the country to do more in LGBT rights. We gave them some money to start their programs. There was a competitive thing, but it made a huge difference locally. It also gave cover to staff people in those community foundations, some of them in maybe conservative areas, because they could say, here we have outside resources, let's add to them.
I think Vinny makes also an interesting point I don't know whether, Mary, you want to comment on it, but foundations are not just money. They're also reputation. And giving a grant to an organization can sometimes help its reputation. But they're also a source of good advice, because staff members, like Willie and Larry and Mary, really know something and want to help. And so it's both money, reputation, but also good advice. We had a question here. We're running out of time, so Mary, I may give you one last question after this.
We only have two questions. That was the other question.
Okay, we'll take a question here then.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Keja Acheris. I'm with Global Green Grants Fund, and we're a public foundation. We work throughout the world supporting grassroots movements. We have advisors that work throughout the world that are local in the communities they serve, and we work on climate justice, environmental justice, social justice issues. We do quite a lot of work with women's rights and indigenous rights, and one of the things that we're seeing quite a bit, we're actually by Human Rights Funder Network, by number of grants that we've given, are considered one of the largest funders in the world globally. One of the things that we're seeing quite a bit in the work that we're doing is around, we're working more and more on corporate accountability and supporting movements that are fighting corporations, whether it's indigenous people who are fighting land. We supported an organization in the Amazon, for example, that 500,000 acres of their land, of their territories, was going to be grabbed for oil. We support organizations that are working to fight palm oil, on and on and on. The land grabbing that goes on every day is just horrendous, as all of you know. So my question is, because this, it gets into history, it gets into present, it gets into future, and it's a very complicated thing for philanthropy because it's tied into who's on your board, how are you investing. There are many layers to this question, but how do you feel philanthropy should now and in the future, also thinking about renewable energies, and we're definitely seeing a lot of the same kind of extractive methods in the renewable energy field happen in as they did for the fossil fuels.
Can we come to the question here?
Yeah, how best to support? How should philanthropy support corporate accountability? How should they be involved? And again, it's more than just money, it's power, it's influence. But
Okay,
what would you say about
thank you. Who would like to tackle that?
Well, use their stock holdings to participate in corporate meetings and raise the issues with the shareholders and so forth. That's had some success, not always as much as we'd like. So sometimes it's naming the problem and identifying how corporations could make a difference. I remember one small foundation giving some shares in ITT to Amnesty, so Amnesty could be at an ITT meeting to talk about problems in Chile. So one has to be creative on these things.
Now, just maybe since we're about, unless Jerry, you have something you want to add on that, or Willie? I was just at I'm on the committee to help select the Carnegie Fellows, and we had one really interesting proposal that really got to me. One of my real concerns at MacArthur is that we supported a lot of conservation groups, and biodiversity was the lens through which we did this, and that meant trying to get large parts of land in countries around the world with high biodiversity to elevate those lands to high protected status. And it turns out a lot of the places are in countries where there are dictators. Fujimori, Castro, Kagame may not quite fit that, but close. And what I found was that they were very willing to work with conservation NGOs because it was a way of buying some favorable publicity in the West with the liberals who supported conservation groups. But what nobody cared much about was what happens to people who are living on the land when you elevated status to highly protected. And it turns out the conservation groups don't do much with that issue. And so I think we need, and this is what I was working on at MacArthur, a set of standards that donors would use in making grants to conservation groups that would require some concern and protection of indigenous people. So it's not just corporate sponsors, but there are also NGOs that need some guidance, if not direction from foundations. Anyway, we're at our witching hour, and I want to thank all our panelists, including Lloyd, who's not with us, but I think this has been a really good discussion, and I especially appreciate all the questions we've gotten from the audience and my ability to call on people along the way and their wonderful contribution. And I think this goes back to what Rita Hauser really wanted us to do, which was to have a conversation among people in the human rights field about issues that are facing us and how we can do better. And we've got 3 more panels coming up. It's going to be terrific. And I thank everybody, panelists, audience alike. We're all part of the same community here. Thank you very much.